A total of 65 cases have now been analysed. Of the latest 31, 3 of which had 2 perpetrators and 3 of which were a group of over 4 people with different levels of involvement in the crimes. The total in this part, not including group accomplices, is 34 killers, bringing the total to 72 people with blood eternally on their hands. My conscience still bothers me, especially in regards to 1 or 2 cases. Is this irresponsible? I don't want to glamorise these people, and in this context glamorisation means the same thing as vilification. Wolf in sheep's clothing is subtly glamorising, damning with faint praise to praising with fierce criticism. There's nothing cool here. Simple insecurity plays a big part. I don't want to be some kind of base true crime ghoul. It's tacky and tabloidy. While we're on the subject, true crime is not news, and they lie anyway, and I don't want to peddle these lies further. Outside of all this, I'm still painfully aware of the limitations of this project and what can be done with it, but my excitement to see what's been tallied up eclipses my self-doubt. That, and the hope others will contribute to this strange but ever-growing database. When reviewing this data, it became clear that the second third doesn't focus as much on the background, mental health and personality as the first third, and instead explores what the murderer exactly did in more detail. It's not clear why this is, and I still do my best to capture as many details as possible. Indeed, new tags or tropes have been added to capture details of the latest cases, and some tags and tropes have not been represented at all in the second third. Forced cross-dressing, impotency, parental abandonment, and paranoid personality disorder aren't represented in the imposed history category. The tags from the enforced history category that have not come up this time around are attempted murder, attempted suicide, connection to nursing, criminal versatility, family revelations, and zoophilia. Regarding the crimes themselves, fake letters, hotel mattress body, and infant farming / abortions are not represented in the second third. Other existing tags have either exploded, stayed the same, or diminished, and the new tags we will discuss when we get to them. Curiously, the second third is less misogynistic than the first, which showed a whopping 20 that killed mostly or exclusively women, as opposed to only 13 this time, owing to the killers targeting a mix of victims, or more that targeted mostly or exclusively men, 6 this time around as opposed to 4 last time. But details like this aren't necessarily relevant to what's interesting in true crime, and more about what I find interesting in my own database. Similarities with the first third see the tags rapist crime and robbery / theft / burglary history being the most numerous, with both cases granting more than 10 tags. Once again, rapist crime is actually the most common tag, with 15 cases and at least 17 perpetrators this time around. Edmund Kemper, Gerald Gallego, Lonnie Franklyn, Robert Long, Clifford Olsen, Leonard Lake and Charles Ning, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Brueno, Fred West, Albert DeSalvo, Joseph DeAngelo, William Bonin, Robert Hansen, Donald Gaskins, Angel Resendez and Randy Kraft all committed sexual assault during their crime spree. With this third, rapist history was also prominent. Those that committed sexual assault before their first murder include Gerald Gallego, Lonnie Franklyn, Robert Long, Clifford Olsen, Bianchi and Brueno, Fred and Rose West, Jack Unterwenger, DeSalvo, DeAngelo, Bonin, Hansen, Gaskins and Kraft. Robert Joseph Long and Joseph DeAngelo were particularly prolific rapists before escalating to murder. With regards to a history involving general stealing, Gallego, Charles Ning, Bianchi and Brueno, Arthur Shawcross, Charles Sobhraj, Jack Unterweger, DeAngelo, Robert Hansen and Donald Gaskins had a history of taking from others. The act of stealing during their crime spree was less well represented. Sobhraj, DeAngelo and Resendez are the only 3 to partake. The first third saw a lot of juvenile delinquency and alcoholic / tyrant father tags. This third also saw a lot of them, but not as numerous, less than 10 counts. Again, the term juvenile delinquency is nebulous, but Gerald Gallego, Clifford Olsen, Charles Ning, Charles Sobhraj, Albert DeSalvo, William Bonin and Donald Pee Wee Gaskins really stood out. The alcoholic and or tyrant father had 14 tags last time, but this time only around 6, which is quite a drop. Nannie Doss, Charles Ning, Jack Unterweger, Albert DeSalvo, Peter Sutcliffe and William Bonin all having boozing and or authoritarian dads. If I were bad at interpreting data, I might say having an abusive father makes you kill less than 10 people, but luckily I'm not that stupid. It's a good reminder to be careful in these interpretations. Interestingly, black or female serial killers, and one Hispanic, have become much more prominent. Vickie Jackson, Marie Becker and Nannie Doss were the 3 female serial killers in this third, and Lonnie Franklyn, Vaughn Greenwood, Carl Watts, Manuel Moore and the rest of his group were all black, and Angel Resendez is Hispanic and born outside the country of some of his crimes. Depressingly, another very common tag this time around is child killer, with 13 of the cases featuring the murder of at least one person below or equal to the age of 12. Olsen, Doss, Lake and Ning, Bianchi and Brueno, Shawcross, both Wests, Mullin, Bonin, George Peter and Gaskins all partook in one of the worst depravities. The first third, quote-unquote, only had 5. Those are all the most common tags for this portion of the project, but there's still a lot to get through. 9 of these cases involved kidnapping as part of their primary criminal activity. Gallego, Long, Lake and Ning, Bianchi and Brueno, Fred West, Watts and the Zebra killers all partook. The Watts and the Zebra murders were the only occasions where rape wasn't involved. Bianchi and Brueno, as well as William Bonin, all had a history for kidnapping also. Let's take a look at the beginning with criminal origins and trauma history. Absent father was noted in 3 cases: Gerald Gallego, Charles Sobhraj and Carl Watts. Only one killer was adopted in this instance, and that was Kenneth Bianchi. There was also only one instance of foster care with Bruce George Peter Lee. This leaves me thinking some details are missing. Significant bereavements showed up in 3 cases: Kenneth Bianchi, his adopted father, although he didn't really seem to care, Dennis Nilsson, his beloved grandfather, who I'd say was much more significant to him than other grandparents to other killers, and Herbert Mullin, who lost a friend and this seemed to worsen his schizophrenia. The ever problematic negligent parents tag is still in the project despite my misgivings. Curiously, it was much better represented with 6 counts: Dennis Rader, Lake, Charles Sobhraj, Nielsen, Bonin and Gaskins. Finally, extreme family crime only showed up once with Gerald Gallego, whose father, whom he never met, murdered 2 policemen. I've talked a lot about absent or bad fathers, now let's have a look at mothers. There are 2 instances of alcoholic and or tyrant mothers. William Bonin, whose mother drank likely to numb the pain of being molested by her father, and Bonin, who also endured an alcoholic father, and one of the most famous tyrannical matriarchs in Clarnell, Elizabeth Kemper, Edmund Kemper's mother. She was famously killed by him, but this isn't the third's only case of matricide. Nannie Doss also killed her mother, who was a more sympathetic victim. I have amended the sexual mother tag to sexual parent to better reflect the reality. Robert Joseph Long sharing a bed with his mother to an uncomfortable age, and Albert DeSalvo was forced to watch his father have sex with prostitutes. Now let's take a look at physical abuse, and it's curiously light. Only 2 instances of beating for John Bunting and William Bonin, which must be wrong. I'm sure many others of the past 30 were beaten as children besides just these 2. Regardless, there are 4 instances of notable head trauma in Dennis Rader, who was dropped on his head as a baby and nearly died, Nannie Doss, who had an accident on a train or coach, both Robert Long and Arthur Shawcross, who had sustained multiple head injuries in their formative years. As I move into the more grievous sexual abuse, there are 6 counts. I've counted Arthur Shawcross, although maybe I shouldn't, and I've not counted Fred West, although maybe I should. Both were stupid men and prolific liars, so maybe I'm just playing a numbers game. The evidence is much more certain with John Bunting, Bonin and Gaskins, who were almost certainly sexually abused. Looking at the archaic MacDonald triad, there are 3 counts of bedwetting, with Arthur Shawcross and Kenneth Bianchi confirmed, and the understudied Herbert Baumeister, who would urinate on his teacher's desk. Consequently, I've renamed this tag bedwetting/enuresis. When it comes to harming small animals, there are 7 cases of killers doing it as children. Dennis Rader, Robert Long, Leonard Nake, DeSalvo, DeAngelo, Carl Watts, and finally Kemper, who killed the family cat. John Bunting did it as an adult, but this was likely just as an abattoir worker. It's not clear how much he enjoyed this job. Finally, arson. A history of fire starting is in Arthur Shawcross, Robert Hansen, who burnt down a school garage as an adult, and George Peter, who was only getting started. George Peter was also the only killer in the second third who used arson in his murders and history. In his case, it was his exclusive murder method. Sobhraj also burnt bodies during his spree, but it wasn't necessarily the method of killing. Killers who were bullied as children or adolescents were fewer this time around, that I know of, with only Carl Watts and butcher baker Robert Hansen being apparently noteworthy enough. Watts likely bullied for his low intelligence, and Hansen for his acne and infamous stutter. Social outcast was also an underused tag, with only William Bonin qualifying. Again, there must be more. Alcohol and drugs continues to play its part, with Nilsson being an alcoholic and Herbert Mulling being a little too partial to LSD. Finally, the not yet mentioned Charlene Gallego, who, despite her promising childhood, let booze and drugs have a major influence on her life. 2 killers were also homeless, Bonin at least once, and Resendez for perhaps most of his life. So far, the tags were present in the previous third, but there's been a few new ones. These 2 are particularly heavy, being juvenile murder prior to the main killings and family murder as part of the main killings. Neither of these tags are triggered when the victim is the killer's mother, which already has a tag. The former loads into the Wrath Index and the latter depravity. Ed Kemper had both, killing his grandparents aged 15. Given he also later killed his mother, he's the killer that had murdered the most family members thus far. That is, if you don't count Nannie Doss, who killed at least 4 blood relatives. Family murder is more common with both of the Wests killing their own children, sometimes more than once, and Gaskin, who killed his niece. 2 more underused tabs are domestic abuser and failed marriages, both of which are fairly self-explanatory. Both of these tabs were present with Gerald Gallego, who was a particularly nasty husband to multiple women. The second domestic abuser was Fred West, not so much against his wife, but for the sheer tyranny of the children of 25 Cromwell Street. Indeed, Rose West counts for this as well, and Robert Long and Angelo Brueno were the 4th and 5th abuser. Vickie Jackson had at least 3 marriages, but it isn't known if she suffered from or inflicted domestic abuse. Failed marriages were almost as common, and I put the count at 2 or more divorces. Charlene Gallego, Kenneth Bianchi and Arthur Shawcross also qualify. Shawcross is also worthy of note, being the only killer this time who was tagged as a bully. Again, my records must be incomplete. This concludes most of, but not quite, the tropes relating to the killer's backgrounds. All that's left is the final tally for the trauma history. William Bonin is the only killer I would consider to have an extreme trauma history from this portion of the project. Others came close and maybe I should have included them, but Bonin's really stood out. Interestingly, it's the low trauma history for this portion that was represented more. Dennis Rader, Charlene Gallego, Clifford Olsen, Herbert Baumeister and Randy Kraft all have backgrounds that seem to lack any significant or brutal trauma. It's possible we just don't know, but until I'm told otherwise, I have to assume there's a growing case for nature as a congenital psychopath rather than nurture. So let's take a closer look at mental health. The two that jump out for being particularly psychopathic are Clifford Olsen and Joseph DeAngelo, the former for his high score on the PCLR and the latter for reasons that should be obvious. Call it an intuitive leap. There were only 5 diagnosed with ASPD this time around: Rader, Bianchi, Baumeister, Bonin and Watts, all being diagnosed. Nielsen was likely a sufferer of BPD as well as narcissistic personality disorder, a condition shared with Rader and Unterwenger, who were formerly diagnosed. There was also an additional schizoid personality disorder in Leonard Lake. Schizophrenia made a reappearance, with Herbert Mulling being the standout example, with his delusions clearly influencing his crimes. Peter Sutcliffe and Robert Hansen may also have been schizophrenic, but it's debatable how much their murders were influenced by this. Herbert Baumeister was also a schizophrenic of some kind. I've also merged paranoid schizophrenia and schizophrenia into the same tab. There were 7 instances of killers with mental disorders that don't yet have a tab or have disorders that are very specific. Dennis Rader had obsessive-compulsive disorder, Bianchi passive-aggressive personality disorder, and Bonin with sexual sadism disorder. Bonin also suffered from bipolar disorder, as did Robert Hansen. Robert Long had XXY syndrome and possibly something else. Shawcross had pyrophilia and also XYY syndrome, and George Peter had epilepsy and possibly something else such as pyrophilia. Rose West was the only killer tagged with unknown mental illness, and I think that's reasonable. There was also slightly less information on IQ. The highest and unlikely to be beat was Charlene Gallego at 160. Kemper, Charles Sobhraj and Randy Kraft also likely had high IQs. Kenneth Bianchi and William Bonin were both above average. Arthur Shawcross and Fred West had below average IQs, and the lowest IQs were between Carl Watts and George Peter. Again, only wild speculation and some less reliable sources allow me to guess the others. High IQ, Jack Unterwenger was a creative and articulate individual, and thus is the only remaining from the batch I theorise might have had a high IQ. Above average, Nelson, Jackson, Becker, Doss, Baumeister, Lake, DeSalvo and DeAngelo. Average, Dennis Rader, Brueno, Long, Rose West and Gaskins. Below average, Gerald Gallego, Bunting, Franklyn, Olsen, Greenwood, Ning, Mullin, Sutcliffe, Hansen, Resendez, and none of them struck me as particularly stupid in the low IQ territory this time around. In this part of the recap, I look at a new tag called Double Life. One could argue all serial killers lead a double life, but in the case of Dennis Rader, Herbert Baumeister and Joseph DeAngelo, they were completely unassuming and often pillars of their community. This links with my normal tag, which was given only to Dennis Rader for seemingly being above suspicion. Perhaps more of them should have been given this tag. DeAngelo was something of a bully in his later years, so I don't think he'd qualify, but he did get the devious tag along with Unterwenger, Kemper and Sobhraj, who all demonstrated a certain cunning in their lives. Taunting the police returned in this third, with Rader and DeAngelo enjoying the feeling of power from mocking the authorities, and with this third the new tag of taunting the victims, which DeAngelo partook in. William Bonin also crossed this line. Both Rader and DeAngelo also wanted media attention for their crimes. Staging didn't appear as prominently, with only DeSalvo and Kraft posing the bodies. The Hillside Stranglers also staged their victims. What did show up again was an interest in Nazism, with John Bunting having a keen interest in the Third Reich. But interestingly, he didn't cross racial lines, as far as I'm aware. But a lot of others did, which destroys my theory that serial killers rarely kill outside their own ethnicity. Greenwood, DeSalvo, Watts, the Zebra Murderers, Gaskins and Resendez all killed people who were a different ethnicity to their own. Sometimes that was even the primary goal. Other killers that cross ethnic lines include Kemper, Long, and the Hillside Strangler duo, but these weren't highlighted during the case. They all killed at least one person not of their own ethnicity. Voyeurism was represented in Kemper, Rader and Fred West, and greed was a major factor in Nannie Doss, Marie Becker, Bunting and Sobhraj, with Sobhraj also having a criminal history in fraud as well as much more. There were 5 instances of the killers having a connection to the armed forces. Kemper, Bonin, Shawcross and Watts all had fathers who served, and Mullin tried to join the army. Kemper, Rader and Bianchi all tried to join the police force. None had a connection to nursing this time around. There was one overt connection to nursing in that Vickie Jackson was a nurse, and Nielsen, D'Angelo and Hansen all worked with the police to some capacity. D'Angelo was also in the Navy, whereas Bonin, Rader and Kraft were all involved in the Air Force. The army proper was once again the strongest represented, with Lonnie Franklyn, both Lake and Ning, Shawcross, Nielsen, DeSalvo and Hansen having all served. As we move away from professions, only Donald Gaskins had a connection to organised crime, and that's quite a weak and questionable connection. The victim escaped tag is proving problematic because many killers had victims who survived them. Sutcliffe's would-be victim stands out, and the would-be victims of both Hansen and Resendez escaped and ultimately proved to be their undoing. Something similar happened with Albert DeSalvo, but there were other cases of victims escaping. Rader, Long, Nielsen, West, maybe others, but in these cases the circumstances were a little different. Varying murder methods is also an ill-defined tag, but it seems Bianchi and Brueno, Mullin, Watts and Gaskins all seemingly having no favourite way to kill. Gaskins is also the killer who demonstrated the most in criminal versatility throughout his life. There were no Bluebeard serial killers this time around, but there were 2 Black Widows in Nannie Doss and Marie Becker. There were many more hitchhiker kills this time around, a testament to just how dangerous that activity is. Kemper, Gallego, West, Mullin, Bonin, Gaskins and Kraft took victims by simply picking them up. 3 of them feigned insanity, Bianchi, Shawcross and likely Sutcliffe. 4 of them indulged in prison relationships once incarcerated, Bianchi, Brueno, Shawcross and Sobhraj. But some didn't need to go to prison to find the loves of their lives. The concept of a morality pet is still a confusing detail, with Clifford, Olsen and Fred West seemingly having a very special place for their wives, despite both of them being particularly nasty entries. I hadn't anticipated how common it is for killers to make some kind of record of their crimes. Lonnie Franklyn, Bunting and West all made recordings, and Leonard Lake and Charles Ning videotaped their crimes. Franklyn, West and the Boneyard murderers also took photographs. Other photographers include Kemper, Rader, Nielsen and Kraft. Trophies were overtly taken by Rader, West, Hansen and Resendez. I've introduced a tongue-in-cheek tag called Grace of the Devil for turns of fortune towards the killer and away from the victims and cops. Sutcliffe's kindred hoaxer and Bonin's sentence-reducing clerical error are the 2 starkest examples. I've also introduced a new tag called Long Criminal Career for killers who commit crimes and get away with it for a prolonged period, or commit more crime after release. From the previous third, I've retroactively awarded this distinction to both Otis Toole and Henry Lucas, Terry Rasmussen and Kenneth MacDuff, 24, 25 and 27 years respectively. This tag had some weird nuances we'll see more of in a bit, but quickly you can see MacDuff had a lengthy prison sentence in his criminal career, and both Toole and Lucas were in and out of prison as well. Perhaps it's more accurate to say this duration is from their first murder, all the way to the final sentencing. From the second third, Lonnie Franklyn, Donald Gaskins and Dennis Rader all had long criminal careers for very different reasons, 23, 30 and 31. Gaskins' inclusion is problematic, getting his first and last kill while in prison. thus technically making him active on death row. Another killer that really surprised me in this category was Giggling Granny Nannie Doss, who was at large for 28 years. Of course, the longest is still Joseph D'Angelo, who evaded authorities for 40 years before hero Paul Holes put a stop to that. As we enter the more gruesome details of the murders, we're again looking at the tag called Killing Spree. Killing Spree is loaded into the Wrath Index, and I'm already having second thoughts on that. Perhaps it's more of a depraved act. As previously explained, it's the act of killing more than 3 people in the space of, let's say, a few minutes. The killers with body counts less than 10 likely didn't have enough kills to constitute a spree. Of the latest cases, Rader, Mullen, George Peter and the Zebra murderers all fit the definition of having committed a spree killing. More new tags relate to incest, either having a history with it and or incest being a part of their main crime spree. Gallego, Lake, Shawcross, both Fred and Rose West and William Bonin all had a history in it, and Ed Kemper and Fred West had the act as part of their wider criminal activities. And now we take a look at the torturing of victims. Both Lake and Ning, both Bianchi and Brueno, Bunting, West, Bonning, Watts, Hanson, the Zebra murderers, Gaskins and Randy Kraft all tortured their victims, sometimes quite horrifically. There was no instance of reviving a victim and killing them again, but Gerald Gallego, who erroneously buried some of his victims alive, has been given the tag cruel and unusual, in addition to torture. Charles Sobhraj, meanwhile, set fire to victims who may well have still been alive, which is especially upsetting. Sobhraj also joined Steve Wright and John Haig as the serial killers to have demonstrated a gambling addiction. I'm sure there's others though. There was only one cannibal this time, and once again the perpetrator, Vaughn Greenwood, only drank the blood of the victims. Necrophilia also felt somewhat underrepresented, with only Kemper overtly having sexual intercourse with a body. Nilsson was somewhat necrophilic, and Fred West allegedly committed this depravity as well. And the worst is for the last, those who sexually abused children. Bianchi and Brueno, Donald Gaskins and Arthur Shawcross all did this at least once, Bianchi and Brueno gang raping a 12-year-old girl. But some of the other killers were more prolific in this aspect. Clifford Olsen, Fred West and William Bonin were especially paedophilic. Once again, I'm positively light-headed and reeling from the details. My own calculations are the last thing to tally. 8 indexes to try and better understand how these murderers work and operate. There's been a few adjustments to my formulas, so let's see what we can see. The pain index relates to physical abuse against the victim. Last time Henry Lucas took the high spot, but even his past is second to the trauma of William Bonin and the pain he experienced. The despair index is next, tallying the killer's mental trauma. Bianchi scored the highest, with him being adopted, bereaved at a young age, and his failed marriages, but he doesn't beat Eileen Warnos. Bianchi also scored high on the Madness Index, alongside Dennis Rader. Both of these men had 3 known mental health issues, but they're not quite as mad as Danny Rolling, who also had the Oedipal element. The Wrath Index denotes acts the perpetrator carried out beside murder on their environment. The results are spread thin, with only George Peter standing out, given his history and crime involving arson, as well as an attack counting as a spree. But this rage against the outside world doesn't top Peter Curtin's aggressive actions. When it comes to deviousness, Charles Sobhraj is the worst, taking down John Edwards. The Pervert Index was ultimately a tie between Alcala and Kraft, with me not knowing who was the worst of those two. For now, they share the bottom spot in this aspect. The first third didn't have much in the way of a tactician, but this time saw Dennis Rader as the killer with a plan, but Joseph D'Angelo was the most organised and tactical in this regard. And now we reach the worst of the worst. Gerald Gallego hasn't been mentioned yet, especially when you consider his case started many new tags. but his type is spread thin. The same can be said of Donald Gaskins. Once again, Bianchi and Brueno scored high in the depravity index. They were both kidnappers with a history of kidnapping, they were torturers, and child killers and child rapists. Both of them rival Peter Curson and Joachim Kroll from the first third, but there's one worst of all. The new tags related to incest give another dimension to depravity, and when tallied with kidnapping, torture, and possibly necrophilia as well, it makes for one disturbing individual. The incest deserves special mention because it's rare killers do that to their own children. Many of them at least keep up the facade of being dedicated family men, if it even is a facade. But this case was the head of a family and showed them no boundaries or decency. If you haven't guessed, by my calculations, Fred West is the most depraved individual covered so far. The symbiotic details between him and his wife are a bit of a mystery, but the result was something that even amongst evil serial killers really stands out. I'm already exhausted, and now we must enter the final third, the most prolific serial killers of the past 100 years. I need to take a break, but the dread of what comes next will taint any relaxation I try to bank. Let's finish this.